When I asked about the date of my son's clinic opening, my daughter-in-law said, "We celebrated yesterday, just for people who owns a diploma." A week later, she called, "The bank is calling, did you transfer it?" I replied, "Didn't I tell you?" I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought a simple question would shatter what was left of my relationship with my son. At 63, I've learned that life has a cruel way of showing you exactly where you stand in people's hearts, but nothing prepared me for what happened that Tuesday morning in November. I was sitting in my kitchen, stirring sugar into my coffee when I decided to call Glenn. The steam from my mug fogged up my reading glasses as I dialed his number, my fingers moving automatically across the keypad I'd memorized years ago. The morning light filtered through my worn curtains, casting familiar shadows across the wooden table where Margaret and I used to share breakfast. 5 years since she passed, and I still set out 2 cups out of habit. "Hey, Dad," Glenn answered on the third ring, his voice carrying that distracted tone I'd grown accustomed to. In the background, I could hear the familiar sounds of his busy household. Amelia's voice giving instructions to someone, probably their housekeeper. "Morning, son," I said, settling back into my chair. "I was wondering if you could tell me the date for your clinic opening. I want to make sure I have it marked on my calendar." The silence that followed was longer than it should have been. I could hear him shifting, maybe moving to another room. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost hesitant. "Dad, about that." Before he could finish, I heard Amelia's voice in the background, sharp and clear. She must have taken the phone from him because suddenly she was speaking directly to me. "Edward, we celebrated yesterday. The opening was just for people who own a diploma." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat there, coffee cup halfway to my lips, trying to process what I'd just heard. Yesterday. They had celebrated yesterday, and I hadn't even known it was happening. "I see," I managed to say, my voice steady despite the fact that my hands had started trembling slightly. "It was a professional event," Amelia continued, her tone matter-of-fact, as if she were explaining something obvious to a child. "You understand, don't you? We had to keep it exclusive." "Exclusive?" The word echoed in my mind as I stared out my kitchen window at the small garden I'd been tending for 30 years. The same hands she deemed unworthy of her professional event had worked 60-hour weeks in construction to pay for Glenn's medical school. The same hands had signed loan documents and written check after check to ensure my son could pursue his dreams. "Of course," I said quietly. "I understand perfectly." Glenn took the phone back. "Dad, I'm sorry. I meant to call you later and explain." "No need to explain, son. Congratulations on your opening." I hung up before either of them could say anything else. The dial tone filled my kitchen, mixing with the sound of my own breathing. I set the phone down carefully as if it might break and looked at my hands. These were working man's hands, scarred from years of construction work, weathered from providing for my family. Amelia was right about one thing. I didn't have a diploma hanging on my wall. What I had was something different. A work ethic that had never failed me, and a love for my son that had cost me everything. The irony wasn't lost on me. In my bedroom closet, tucked away in an old shoebox, sat the paperwork for the $80,000 I'd planned to invest in Glenn's clinic. Money I'd saved for 40 years, living modestly, driving the same pickup truck since 2008, wearing clothes until they fell apart. Margaret used to joke that I was too careful with money, but I always told her I was saving for something important, that something important was supposed to be Glenn's future. I walked to my bedroom, moving slowly, feeling every one of my 63 years. The floorboards creaked under my feet, a sound that usually comforted me, but now seemed to echo my isolation. I opened the closet door and pulled down the shoebox. Inside, along with the investment papers, was a photograph from Glenn's medical school graduation. He was wearing his cap and gown, grinning widely, and I was standing next to him in my best suit, the one I'd bought specifically for that day. Margaret had taken the picture, and I remembered how proud she'd been, how she'd cried tears of joy. "Our boy did it, Eddie," she'd whispered to me that day. "Our boy is going to be a doctor." Our boy. But he wasn't ours anymore, was he? He belonged to Amelia now, to her world of diplomas and exclusive events. I was just the man who'd paid for it all. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the photograph, remembering all the sacrifices Margaret and I had made. The vacations we never took, the car repairs I did myself, the dinners of beans and rice when money was tight. All so Glenn could have what we never did: an education, a profession, a chance at a better life. The phone rang again. My heart jumped, thinking maybe Glenn was calling back to apologize, to invite me to a private celebration, to acknowledge what I'd done for him. But when I answered, it was Amelia's voice again. "Edward, I hope you understand that this isn't personal. It's just that Glenn's colleagues and clients need to see him as professional, independent. Having family there especially, well, it might send the wrong message." "Especially what?" I wanted to ask. Especially his father who worked construction? Especially the man who raised him alone after his mother died? Especially the person who'd never missed a payment on his student loans? "I understand," I said again, because what else was there to say? "Good. Oh, and Edward? Glenn mentioned you were planning to help with the clinic financially. We're going to need that soon. The loan payments start next month, and we have some additional expenses coming up." There it was. They didn't want me at their celebration, but they wanted my money. I closed my eyes, feeling something shift inside me, something that had been building for months without my realizing it. "We'll talk about that later," I said. "Well, don't wait too long. The first payment is due in 3 weeks." After she hung up, I sat in the quiet of my bedroom, still holding Glenn's graduation photo. The young man in the picture looked so happy, so full of promise. I'd been so proud that day, so sure that all our sacrifices had been worth it. Now I wondered if I'd raised a son or funded a stranger. I put the photograph back in the box, but I kept the investment papers in my hand. $80,000. It represented everything. My life savings, Margaret's life insurance, money I'd set aside from every paycheck for decades. Money that was supposed to secure Glenn's future and give him the independence he needed to succeed. But as I sat there in the afternoon light filtering through my bedroom window, I realized something important. Independence works both ways. If Glenn was independent enough to exclude his father from his professional life, then maybe I was independent enough to make my own decisions about my money. For the first time in months, I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile, but it was something. It was the smile of a man who'd just discovered he still had choices to make. I folded the investment papers carefully and put them in my wallet. Tomorrow, I decided I would pay a visit to the bank, not to transfer money to my son's clinic, but to explore some options I'd never considered before. After 40 years of putting Glenn first, maybe it was time to put Edward first for a change. The next morning, I sat in my kitchen with my second cup of coffee, watching the steam rise while memories I'd tried to push away came flooding back. It's funny how one moment of clarity can make you see patterns that were right in front of you all along. The exclusion from Glenn's clinic opening wasn't the beginning. It was just the latest chapter in a story that had been writing itself for years. It started, I realize now, the day Glenn married Amelia. I remember that wedding day vividly. Margaret had been gone for 6 months, and I was still learning how to navigate the world without her steady presence beside me. Glenn seemed genuinely happy, and Amelia was beautiful in her designer dress that cost more than my monthly pension. I'd paid for half the wedding, $12,000, because I wanted Glenn to start his marriage without financial stress, but even then there were signs. During the father-son dance, Glenn seemed distracted, his eyes constantly finding Amelia across the room. When I tried to share a memory about Margaret, how proud she would have been to see this day, he cut me short. "Dad, let's not get emotional," he'd said, patting my shoulder in a way that felt more dismissive than comforting. "This is a celebration." I should have paid attention to that moment. The son I'd raised wouldn't have dismissed his mother's memory so casually. But I told myself he was just nervous, overwhelmed by the big day. I made excuses because I wanted to believe my boy was still in there somewhere. The changes came gradually after that. At first, they were small things. Glenn stopped calling every Sunday. our tradition since he'd left for college. When I called him, conversations became shorter, more perfunctory. He'd always have somewhere to be, someone waiting for him. Amelia's voice was often in the background, and sometimes I could hear her impatient sighs when our calls went longer than 15 minutes. Then there were the holidays. The first Christmas after their wedding, they invited me to their new house, a beautiful colonial in an upscale neighborhood that I knew they couldn't afford on Glenn's residence salary alone. I brought my traditional green bean casserole, the one Margaret had made every year, the one Glenn used to beg for as a child. Amelia took one look at the dish and smiled that particular smile I was beginning to recognize, the one that never reached her eyes. "Oh, Edward, how thoughtful. But we've hired a caterer this year. Everything's already prepared." She took my casserole, and I swear I saw her consider putting it straight in the trash before thinking better of it. "I'll just put this in the kitchen. Maybe we can have it later." We never did have it later. I found the untouched casserole in their garbage can when I went to throw away my coffee cup. That same Christmas, Glenn gave me a golf shirt from a discount store, still with the clearance tag on it, $9.99. Meanwhile, Amelia was wearing a necklace that must have cost thousands, a early Christmas gift from Glenn, she'd announced proudly. I started to understand the new hierarchy then. I was becoming the obligation, the duty to be managed rather than the father to be cherished. The breaking point should have been Margaret's birthday the following year. I'd planned a small memorial dinner, just Glenn and me, to honor her memory. We used to do this together. Visit her grave, share stories, keep her alive in our memories. It was important to me, and I thought it was important to Glenn too. He canceled 3 hours before we were supposed to meet. "Dad, I'm really sorry, but Amelia's parents are in town unexpectedly. We have dinner reservations at that new French place downtown. You understand, right?" I understood, all right. I understood that Margaret's memory could be postponed for Amelia's parents. I understood that the woman who'd raised Glenn, who'd sacrificed everything for his education, who'd worked 2 jobs while battling cancer so we could afford his college prep courses, was now less important than impressing his in-laws. That night, I sat at Margaret's grave alone, eating the dinner I'd prepared for 2, and I made a decision. I stopped trying so hard. I stopped calling every week. I stopped volunteering to help with their problems. I waited to see if my son would notice, if he would reach out. He didn't. The months that followed were a master class in how relationships die by neglect. Glenn would call occasionally, usually when he needed something. Advice about a car purchase, help understanding some financial paperwork, a loan for this or that. But the calls about how I was doing, about my health, about whether I was lonely, those calls stopped coming altogether. Yesterday morning, after that devastating phone call about the clinic opening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I drove to their neighborhood. I didn't plan to stop by their house. I just wanted to see it, to try to understand the life my son had built without me. Their street was lined with perfect lawns and expensive cars, the kind of neighborhood where people worried about property values and homeowners association rules. I parked across from their house and watched. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Amelia came home in a brand new BMW, a car that definitely hadn't been there 6 months ago. She was carrying shopping bags from stores I recognized but had never been able to afford. As she walked to her front door, her phone rang, and I could hear her laughing, animated in a way she never was, around me. 20 minutes later, a landscaping truck arrived. Professional lawn care, even though Glenn used to love working in the yard as a teenager. We'd spent countless Saturday mornings together, planting flowers, trimming hedges, teaching him that taking care of your home was taking care of your family. As I sat there watching strangers maintain my son's property, I realized something that cut deeper than all the casual cruelties and dismissed invitations. They were living far beyond their means. The house, the car, the lifestyle, none of it added up to what a new doctor should be able to afford, even with Amelia's job at the marketing firm. That's when I understood why Amelia had been so quick to mention the financial help they needed. This wasn't about supporting a new business venture. This was about funding a lifestyle, about maintaining an image that was already stretched to its breaking point. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through the old neighborhoods where I'd grown up, where Margaret and I had first lived, where we'd raised Glenn with second-hand furniture and homemade meals and all the love two people could give. When I got home, I called the bank where I've done business for 37 years. Sarah, the manager who'd helped me set up Glenn's college fund all those years ago, was still there. Edward, nice to hear from you. How's Glenn? I heard he opened his own practice. That's actually why I'm calling, Sarah. I need to ask you about some documents I signed a while back. There was a pause. What kind of documents? I think I might have co-signed some loan paperwork for Glenn's clinic. I need to know exactly what I've committed to. Another pause, longer this time. Edward, I'll need to pull your file, but off the top of my head, you're listed as a guarantor on a business loan for $200,000. The first payment is due. In 3 weeks, I finished for her. I know. That night, I sat in my living room, Margaret's photograph on the table beside me, and I made a list. On one side, I wrote down everything I'd given Glenn over the years. Not just money, though, that was substantial, but time, energy, love, sacrifice. On the other side, I wrote down what I'd received in return, especially in the last 2 years. The second column was very short. As I prepared for bed, my phone rang one more time. Glenn's number appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment my heart lifted. Maybe he'd had time to think. Maybe he'd realized how much he'd hurt me. Maybe he wanted to apologize. Dad? His voice was strained, worried. Yes, son? I just wanted to make sure we're still good about the money situation. Amelia mentioned she talked to you today, and I want to make sure there aren't any misunderstandings. Not an apology. Not an acknowledgement. Just concern about the money. Oh, we're perfectly clear, Glenn. No misunderstandings at all. But as I hung up the phone and turned off the lights, I knew that tomorrow would bring the kind of clarity that changes everything. Because I'd finally understood something important. Love shouldn't be a one-way transaction, and respect isn't something you can buy, even with $80,000 and a lifetime of sacrifice. The question now was what I planned to do about it. The call came exactly 1 week later, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. I was reading the newspaper over my breakfast, savoring the quiet ritual that had become even more precious since Margaret's passing, when my phone rang with an urgency that cut through the morning calm. Edward, thank God you answered. Amelia's voice was different this time, higher-pitched, strained with none of her usual condescending composure. We have a serious problem. I set down my coffee cup slowly, noting how my hand remained perfectly steady. What kind of problem, Amelia? The bank is calling. They want the first payment on Glenn's loan, the one you co-signed for. They're saying if we don't have the money by Friday, they're going to start the foreclosure process on the clinic. I let the silence stretch for a moment, listening to her rapid breathing on the other end. I see. And where's Glenn? He's at the clinic trying to see more patients, but, Edward, we don't have enough revenue yet. We won't for months. We need that $80,000 you promised. We need it today. There was something almost satisfying about the panic in her voice. This was the same woman who had told me just a week ago that I wasn't worthy of attending my own son's celebration. Now she was calling me by my first name, no more dismissive Edward, and practically begging. Did you transfer the money yet? She pressed, when I didn't respond immediately. The bank account number is the same one Glenn gave you months ago. I walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the small vegetable garden I'd planted last spring. Margaret had always wanted a proper garden, but we'd never had the time or the extra money for anything beyond the basics. Now, at 63, I finally had both. The tomatoes were still producing, even this late in November, bright red against the dying vines. Edward? Are you there? Did you hear what I said? I heard you, Amelia. So you'll transfer the money today? I sat back down at my kitchen table, picking up the newspaper I'd been reading. On the front page was an article about retirement planning, about people my age learning to live on fixed incomes. No, Amelia, I won't be transferring any money. The silence that followed was so complete I thought she might have hung up. Then slowly her voice came back, but it was different now, carefully controlled, like she was speaking to someone who might be confused. Edward, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Glenn needs this money. You promised it to him months ago. You signed papers agreeing to guarantee the loan. I'm not confused, Amelia. I understand perfectly. I promised my son financial support for his clinic, and I guaranteed his loan. But circumstances have changed. What circumstances? Her voice was rising again, the careful control slipping away. I wasn't invited to share in his success, so I've decided not to share in his financial obligations either. That's ridiculous. You can't just change your mind because your feelings were hurt. This is business, Edward. This is Glenn's future. I almost laughed at that. After years of being treated like an embarrassment, now suddenly my feelings mattered enough to be acknowledged, even if it was just to dismiss them. You're right, Amelia, this is business, and I've decided it's not a good investment for me anymore. Investment? Her voice cracked on the word. Edward, this is your son we're talking about. Yes, it is. My son, who was too embarrassed by his construction worker father to invite him to his clinic opening. My son, who hasn't called me just to talk in over a year. My son, who apparently needs my money but not my presence in his life. There was a muffled sound, like she'd covered the phone with her hand, and I could hear her talking to someone in the background. Glenn, probably, explaining the disaster that was unfolding. When she came back on the line, her voice had taken on a new quality. Desperate, almost pleading. Edward, please, I know we made a mistake. Glenn knows we made a mistake, but you can't punish him financially because we hurt your feelings. I'm not punishing anyone, Amelia. I'm simply making a business decision, just like you advised. And my business decision is that supporting someone who doesn't want me in their life is not a wise use of my resources. But you signed the guarantee papers. You're legally obligated. Actually, I'm not. I'd spent considerable time the previous week reviewing those papers with Sarah at the bank. I signed as a guarantor contingent on my continued financial support of the venture. Since I'm withdrawing that support, my guarantee is voided. Sarah at First National explained it all to me very clearly. The silence stretched longer this time. When Amelia spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. You planned this. No, Amelia, I reacted to it. There's a difference. Glenn's going to lose everything. Glenn's going to learn something. There's a difference there, too. I heard her take a shaky breath. Edward, I'm sorry. We're both sorry. Glenn wants to talk to you. He's driving over there right now. There's nothing to talk about. My decision is final. But we can work something out. We can include you more. We can have family dinners. We can... Amelia, I interrupted gently. When someone shows you who they are, believe them. You and Glenn showed me exactly who I am in your lives. I believed you. 20 minutes later, as I was washing my breakfast dishes, I heard a car door slam in my driveway with more force than necessary. Through my kitchen window, I watched Glenn stride toward my front door, his face flushed with anger and something else. Fear, maybe, or desperation. He didn't knock. He still had a key, and he used it, walking into my house like he'd done 1,000 times as a boy. But he wasn't a boy anymore, and this wasn't the same house. At least not for him. Dad, what the hell are you doing? I dried my hands slowly on the dish towel Margaret had made years ago, a simple blue and white checked pattern that had faded with countless washings. Good morning, Glenn. Would you like some coffee? I don't want coffee. I want to know why you're sabotaging my clinic. I turned to face my son, this tall, handsome man who looked so much like Margaret around the eyes. For a moment, seeing him standing in our kitchen, I could almost pretend we were still the family we used to be. I'm not sabotaging anything. I'm simply choosing not to enable it. Enable it? His voice rose. Dad, this is my career. This is everything I've worked for. No, Glenn, this is everything we worked for, but apparently only one of us gets to enjoy the success. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was frustrated with homework or couldn't solve a problem. Look, I know you're upset about the opening. Amelia explained it to me. But you have to understand, it was a professional event. I understand perfectly. The question is, do you? Understand what? I walked past him to the living room, to the wall where Margaret and I had hung pictures of Glenn's achievements over the years. His high school graduation, college graduation, medical school graduation, his first day of residency, in every single picture, I was there beside him, beaming with pride. Do you see yourself in any of these pictures, Glenn? He followed my gaze to the wall, confusion clouding his features. Of course I do. What's your point? My point is that for 35 years, I've been there for every important moment in your life. I was there when you took your first steps, when you graduated high school, when you got accepted to medical school, when you finished your residency. I was there through your mother's illness, there when she died, there when you needed someone to co-sign your loans. I turned to face him, seeing Margaret's eyes looking back at me from his face. But apparently, I wasn't good enough to be there when you achieved your dream. The dream I helped pay for. Glenn's shoulders slumped slightly. Dad, it wasn't like that. Then tell me what it was like. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the photos to his feet. When he looked up again, there was something different in his expression, a flicker of the boy I'd raised. Amelia said it would look better if it was just professionals. She said having family there might make me look dependent. Dependent? I let the word hang in the air between us. On the man who raised you alone after your mother died. On the man who worked overtime for 20 years to pay for your education. On the man who guaranteed your business loan because the bank wouldn't approve it otherwise. I know what you've done for me, Dad. I've never forgotten that. Haven't you? I walked to my desk in the corner of the room, opening the drawer where I kept important papers. I pulled out the investment documents I'd prepared months ago, the paperwork that would have transferred $80,000 to Glenn's clinic account. This is what I had planned to give you, I said, holding up the papers. My life savings, Glenn. Every penny I had left after your mother's medical bills and your education, I was going to invest it in your clinic because I believed in you, because I wanted to be part of your success. Glenn stared at the papers, his face pale. Dad. But I realized something last week. You don't want me to be part of your success. You want me to fund it but not share it. You want my money but not my presence. That's not true, isn't it? When's the last time you called me just to talk? When's the last time you asked about my health, my life, my feelings about anything? When's the last time you treated me like a father instead of a bank? Glenn opened his mouth to answer, then, closed it again. We both knew the answer. I've spent my whole life putting you first, Glenn. I put your needs before mine, your future before mine, your happiness before mine, and that was okay when you were a child. That's what parents do. I walked back to the kitchen, needing the comfort of familiar surroundings for what I was about to say. But you're not a child anymore. You're a grown man with a wife and a business and a life that apparently doesn't have room for an aging construction worker, so I've decided to start putting myself first for a change. Glenn followed me, his voice desperate now. Dad, please. The clinic will fail without your help. We'll lose everything. I poured myself another cup of coffee, noting how steady my hands were. Maybe. Or maybe you'll figure out another way. Maybe you'll learn to live within your means. Maybe you'll remember that success isn't just about money and status. What do you want me to do? Apologize? I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry about the opening. I'm sorry about not calling more. I'm sorry about everything. I looked at my son, this successful doctor who was begging for his father's money while apologizing for his father's feelings, and I felt something I'd never felt before, pity for the man I'd raised. I don't want your apology, Glenn. Apologies are just words, and words without change are meaningless. Then what? What do you want? I want you to learn something your mother and I apparently failed to teach you. That family isn't a business relationship, that respect isn't optional, and that the people who love you deserve better than being treated like an inconvenience. Glenn stood there in my kitchen, the place where Margaret had made him countless meals, where I'd helped him with homework, where we'd celebrated his acceptance to medical school, and for the first time in years, he looked like the lost little boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms. But I wasn't going to rescue him from this storm. Some lessons I'd learned have to be survived alone. The clinic will be fine, Glenn, or it won't be. Either way, you'll figure it out. You're a smart man. Everyone keeps telling me so. As he walked toward the door, Glenn turned back one more time. Dad, I love you. You know that, right? I looked at my son, this stranger who shared my name and my DNA, but apparently none of my values, and I felt something inside me finally break free, not break apart, but break free. I know you think you do, Glenn, but love is a verb, not just a feeling, and I haven't seen much action from you lately. After he left, I sat in my quiet kitchen, surrounded by 40 years of memories, and felt something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. Peace. For the first time in years, I'd put myself first and the world hadn't ended. In fact, it felt like it might finally be beginning. 3 days after Glenn's desperate visit, I was sitting in Lou's Diner on Maple Street. The same place where Margaret and I used to go for coffee and pie every Sunday after church. The red vinyl booths were cracked now, the chrome on the tables dulled with age, but the coffee was still strong and the atmosphere still honest. Two qualities that seemed increasingly rare in my life. I was reading the morning paper when Sarah from the bank slid into the booth across from me. At 68, she was one of the few people left who remembered when Glenn was just a gap-toothed kid who came with me to make deposits every Friday afternoon. "You really did it," she said, shaking her head with something between admiration and disbelief. 40 years I've known you, Edward, and I've never seen you make a move like this. I folded my newspaper carefully, buying myself a moment to choose my words. People change, Sarah. Sometimes they have to. This wasn't just a change, though, was it? This was planned. She leaned forward, lowering her voice even though the nearest occupied table was 3 booths away. When you came to see me 3 months ago asking about loan guarantees and financial obligations, you already knew what you were going to do. She was right, of course. What Glenn and Amelia didn't understand, what they couldn't understand because they'd never bothered to really know me, was that 40 years in construction had taught me something valuable about building and planning. You don't just react to problems, you anticipate them. You look at the foundation, assess the structure, and make decisions before the walls start cracking. And the foundation of my relationship with Glenn had been cracking for a long time. "Tell me something, Sarah," I said, stirring sugar into my coffee. "In all your years at the bank, how many times have you seen a parent guarantee a business loan for an adult child?" "Dozens of times." "And how many of those ventures succeeded?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering. "Honestly, maybe 1 in 4, and that's being generous." "What about the ones where the child treated the parent like an inconvenience?" "None of those succeeded. Not a single one." I nodded, unsurprised. Sarah had been in banking long enough to see the patterns, to understand that successful businesses required more than just money. They required respect, communication, and genuine partnership. 3 months ago, I said, when Glenn asked me to co-sign that loan, I started asking questions. Real questions about his business plan, his projected income, his operating expenses. Do you know what I discovered? Sarah shook her head. That he and Amelia were planning to spend more in their first year than most established clinics make in their second or third. They budgeted for a BMW lease, a house payment that was 30% above recommended guidelines, and a lifestyle that assumed immediate success. I pulled out a small notebook from my jacket pocket. The same type I'd carried on construction sites for decades, filled with measurements and calculations and observations. But instead of building specs, this one contained financial records and phone logs and a careful documentation of my son's transformation from grateful child to entitled adult. I also started paying attention to how Glenn talked to me. Really paying attention. Do you know that in the 6 months before his clinic opening, he called me exactly 11 times, and of those 11 calls, 9 were requests for money, advice about money, or questions about the loan guarantee? Sarah winced. And the other 2? One was to tell me he couldn't make it to Margaret's birthday dinner because he had a golf tournament. The other was to ask if I could recommend a good accountant who worked with high net worth individuals. I flipped through my notebook, finding the page where I'd recorded that particular conversation. It had stung at the time. The casual assumption that I wouldn't know anyone successful enough for his needs. But it had also been instructive. That's when I realized that Glenn didn't just take my support for granted anymore. He was actually embarrassed by me. So you started planning. I started investigating. I closed the notebook and met Sarah's eyes. Did you know that Amelia quit her job at the marketing firm 2 months before the clinic opened? Glenn told me she was taking time off to help with the business, but I did some checking. She was let go for excessive personal spending on company accounts. Sarah raised her eyebrows. How did you find that out? Construction workers know people in all kinds of industries, Sarah, including marketing. A friend of mine worked maintenance at Amelia's company. He said she was notorious for charging personal expenses to client accounts and then claiming they were business development costs. I had spent weeks quietly gathering information using the network of working-class contacts I'd built over 4 decades. The maintenance worker at Amelia's company, the loan officer at their mortgage company who went to my church, the clerk at the luxury car dealership where they'd leased the BMW. The picture that emerged wasn't pretty, I continued. They were living on credit, banking on Glenn's immediate success, and assuming my money would cover any shortfalls. But more than that, they were building a life that required my financial support while systematically excluding me from their emotional lives. So, when did you make the decision? The day Glenn called and asked me to increase my loan guarantee from $80,000 to $120,000, he said they'd discovered some unexpected startup costs. I remembered that conversation vividly. Glenn had called while I was working in my garden, and I'd sat down on Margaret's old bench to take the call. He'd been casual about it, almost dismissive, as if asking for an additional $40,000 was like asking to borrow a cup of sugar. I asked him what the unexpected costs were, I said. Do you know what he told me? Sarah shook her head. Upgraded furniture for Amelia's office, professional photography for their social media, a sound system for the waiting room, $40,000 for cosmetic improvements that had nothing to do with patient care or medical equipment. That had been the moment of clarity for me. Not the moment I got angry, but the moment I got smart. I told him I'd think about it and get back to him. Then I called you. Sarah smiled grimly. And I told you exactly what your legal obligations were and weren't. You also told me something else. You told me that most business loans fail within the first year when they're undercapitalized, and you told me that co-signers often end up paying more than the original borrowers because they don't monitor the spending. Over the following weeks, I had quietly begun extricating myself from Glenn's financial web. I visited lawyers, reviewed contracts, and made sure I understood exactly what I was and wasn't responsible for. I learned that my guarantee was contingent on my continued investment partnership, a clause I'd insisted on adding when the original papers were drawn up, though I'd forgotten about it until Sarah reminded me. The thing that Glenn and Amelia never understood, I said, is that I'm not just some old man with a savings account. I've been managing money and making financial decisions my entire adult life. I built a comfortable retirement on a construction worker's salary by being careful, deliberate, and smart. And they assumed you'd hand it all over without question. They assumed a lot of things. They assumed I was desperate for their approval. They assumed I'd tolerate any treatment as long as they occasionally acknowledged my existence. They assumed that being Glenn's father gave me obligations without rights. I had spent those 3 months watching and waiting, hoping Glenn would somehow realize what he was doing, hoping he would call just to check on me or invite me to dinner or show some sign that I still mattered to him beyond my financial usefulness. The clinic opening had been the final test. When Amelia told me it was for people with diplomas only, I knew my suspicions had been correct. I wasn't their family anymore. I was their bank. But here's what they really miscalculated. I said, leaning forward. They thought I needed them more than they needed me. They thought because I'm alone, because Margaret's gone, because I don't have a big social circle or a prestigious career that I'd cling to whatever scraps of relationship they were willing to throw me. And you decided to prove them wrong. I decided to prove something to myself, that I still had dignity, that I still had choices, that I could put myself first for once without the world ending. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing everything I'd told her. Finally, she asked the question I'd been expecting. Do you regret it? Even a little? I thought about Glenn's face when I'd refused to transfer the money, about the panic in Amelia's voice, about the possibility that they might actually lose everything they'd worked for. I regret that it came to this, I said honestly. I regret that my son learned to value money more than relationships. I regret that I apparently failed to teach him about respect and gratitude. I regret that Margaret isn't here to see how this turned out. I paused, watching through the diner window as a father walked by holding his young daughter's hand, pointing out something in a store window that made her laugh. But do I regret refusing to enable their selfishness and disrespect? Do I regret choosing my own dignity over their financial convenience? No, Sarah, I don't regret that at all. As I drove home from the diner that afternoon, I thought about the irony of the situation. Glenn had spent years trying to distance himself from his blue-collar father, trying to prove he was better than his humble origins. But in the end, it was my working-class values, respect, honesty, accountability, that had given me the strength to walk away from his middle-class selfishness. That evening, as I sat in my living room reading a book Margaret had bought me years ago, but I'd never had time to enjoy, my phone rang. Glenn's number appeared on the caller ID, but I didn't answer. Whatever he had to say now after everything that had happened wasn't as important as what he'd failed to say for the past 2 years. I let it go to voicemail, and later, when I was ready, I listened to his message. Dad, I've been thinking about everything you said, and I want you to know that I understand why you're angry. I know we've made mistakes, and I know we hurt you, but the clinic is going to close if we don't get help soon. Amelia's applying for emergency loans, but they want personal guarantees we can't provide. I'm not asking for the full amount anymore. Even 20 or 30,000 would keep us afloat until we can get established. Please, Dad. I know you don't owe me anything, but I'm asking anyway. I'm your son. I deleted the message without saving it. He was my son, but that hadn't mattered to him when he was deciding who deserved to celebrate his success. It wouldn't matter to me now when he was deciding who should pay for his failures. For the first time in years, I went to bed that night without worrying about anyone except myself. And for the first time in years, I slept peacefully through the night. The news reached me on a cold December morning 3 weeks after Glenn's last desperate voicemail. I was shoveling snow from my driveway when Mrs. Henderson from next door came over with that particular expression people wear when they're about to deliver bad news they're not sure they should share. Edward, she said hesitantly, clutching her morning newspaper, I thought you should know. There's an article in the business section about Glenn's clinic. I leaned my shovel against the garage and took the paper from her gloved hands. There, in a small column on page 3 of the business section, was a brief announcement. Riverside Family Medical Clinic closes after 2 months. The article was only 4 sentences long, citing financial difficulties and inability to meet operational costs as reasons for the closure. Mrs. Henderson watched my face carefully as I read. I'm sorry, Edward. I know how proud you were of Glenn becoming a doctor. I folded the newspaper and handed it back to her. I'm still proud of him becoming a doctor, Helen. Becoming a successful businessman is apparently a different skill entirely. After she left, I went back to shoveling snow, but my mind was elsewhere. Despite everything that had happened, despite my anger and disappointment, I felt a hollow sadness for Glenn. Not because his clinic had failed, but that had been inevitable once I withdrew my support, but because he was about to learn some very hard lessons about consequences and responsibility. The first call came that afternoon. Dad, I guess you heard? Glenn's voice was flat, drained of the anger and desperation that had characterized our recent conversations. I did. I'm sorry it didn't work out. There was a long pause. Are you really? I considered the question seriously. I'm sorry you failed, Glenn. I'm not sorry that actions have consequences. We lost everything. The clinic, the lease, the equipment we'd already bought. She's not handling it well. Where are you living? We had to move back in with her parents. They're not happy about it, especially after we told them you refused to help. I almost smiled at that. Amelia's parents had made their feelings about Glenn clear from the beginning. He wasn't quite successful enough, quite established enough for their precious daughter. Having them live in their basement would be its own form of education. What are you going to do now? I don't know. Apply for positions at hospitals, I guess. Try to find someone who will hire me after a business failure. The whole thing is on my credit report now. That's probably for the best, Glenn. Working for someone else will give you experience in how successful medical practices actually operate. Dad, his voice cracked slightly. I know I messed up. I know we treated you badly, but did it have to go this far? I walked to my living room window, looking out at the snow-covered street where Glenn had learned to ride his bike, where Margaret and I had pushed him on his tricycle, where we'd taught him to build snowmen and appreciate the simple pleasures of childhood. Yes, Glenn, it did. Because this is the only way you were ever going to learn that relationships matter, that family isn't a financial transaction, that respect isn't optional. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet house and waited. I knew this wasn't over. Failure has a way of revealing people's true character, and I suspected I was about to see sides of both Glenn and Amelia I'd only glimpsed before. The second call came 2 days later, but it wasn't from Glenn. Edward, this is Amelia. Her voice was cold, controlled, but underneath I could hear something brittle and dangerous. We need to talk. I don't think we do. Oh, but we do. See, Glenn might be willing to just accept this disaster, but I'm not. You destroyed our lives out of petty jealousy, and I think you owe us compensation. I almost laughed. Even in failure, Amelia was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to make herself the victim. I don't owe you anything, Amelia. If anything, you owe me an apology for years of disrespect. Disrespect? Her voice rose. You're a bitter old man who couldn't stand to see his son succeed without you. You sabotaged our business because your feelings were hurt. I withdrew support from people who made it clear they didn't want me in their lives. There's a difference. We're going to sue you, she said suddenly, for intentional interference with business relationships, for fraud, for elder abuse of your own son. This time I did laugh. Elder abuse. Amelia, I'm 63, not 93, and I didn't abuse anyone. I simply chose not to enable your delusions of grandeur. You promised that money. Glenn made business decisions based on that promise. Glenn made business decisions based on arrogance and poor planning. The money was contingent on my continued involvement in his life, which he terminated when he decided I wasn't good enough for his professional image. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Amelia alternating between threats and pleading, but I'd heard enough. When I finally hung up, I made 2 phone calls, one to my lawyer just to be safe, and one to Sarah at the bank to make sure there were no loose financial threads that could come back to complicate my life. Both conversations were brief and reassuring. I had acted within my legal rights, my financial obligations were clear and limited, and Amelia's threats were exactly that, threats with no legal basis. But the real revelation came 3 days later when Glenn showed up at my door again. This time, he looked different. Older, maybe, or just worn down by reality. He was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt instead of his usual designer clothes, and he looked more like the boy I'd raised than the successful doctor he'd become. Can I come in? It's cold out here. I stepped aside and let him into the warmth of my living room. He looked around at the familiar surroundings, Margaret's photographs, my comfortable but modest furniture, the life we'd built together on construction wages and careful planning. Amelia left, he said without preamble. I wasn't entirely surprised, but the news still hit me with unexpected force. Where did she go? Back to her ex-boyfriend in Chicago. Apparently she'd been in contact with him for months. She said living with a failed businessman wasn't what she'd signed up for when she married a doctor. Glenn sat down heavily in the chair where Margaret used to read her evening books, and for a moment I saw him as he really was. Not the successful professional he'd tried to become, but a lost man who'd confused image with substance, who'd traded genuine relationships for superficial status. "She took half our savings account," he continued, "what was left of it anyway, and she kept all the jewelry I'd bought her over the years. Said it was compensation for the lifestyle I'd promised her but couldn't deliver." I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. "I'm sorry your marriage ended, Glenn. Whatever else has happened between us, I never wanted that for you." "Did you know she would leave if the money ran out?" I considered lying, offering him the comfort of believing his wife had genuinely loved him. But Glenn needed truth more than comfort now. "I suspected she might. Amelia married your potential, not your person. When the potential didn't materialize the way she expected, there wasn't much left to hold on to." Glenn laughed bitterly. "You tried to tell me, didn't you? In your way, you tried to warn me. I tried to show you that relationships built on what people can provide, instead of who they are, don't tend to last. But you weren't ready to hear that. I thought I knew better. I thought you were just old-fashioned, stuck in the past. I thought success was about appearances and connections and having the right image. And now? Now I'm 35 years old, divorced, unemployed, living in my ex-in-law's basement, and completely alone. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be strong and independent and moral, who'd somehow lost his way in pursuit of things that ultimately didn't matter. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay, to offer him the financial help that would solve his immediate problems. But I'd learned something important over the past few months. Sometimes love means letting people face the consequences of their choices, even when those consequences are painful to watch. You're not completely alone, Glenn. But you are learning the difference between people who love you and people who use you. It's a hard lesson, but it's an important one. Are you saying you still love me? After everything I've done? I got up and walked to the mantelpiece where Margaret's picture sat beside Glenn's medical school graduation photo. Two people I'd loved completely in different ways, but with the same intensity. I've never stopped loving you, Glenn, but I stopped enabling you. There's a difference, and it took me too long to learn it. So what happens now? Now you figure out what kind of man you want to be. You decide whether you want to build relationships on respect and genuine caring, or whether you want to keep looking for people who'll give you things without expecting anything in return. Glenn was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, there was something different in his eyes. Not the desperation I'd seen before, but something more thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what you said, about love being a verb, not just a feeling. I don't think I understood what you meant before. And now? Now I think I'm starting to. Love is what you do, not what you say. It's showing up, paying attention, making someone feel valued, and I haven't done any of those things for you in a long time." "No, you haven't. I want to try to do better. Not because I need your money, I've learned I can't count on that anymore. But because I want to have a father again. I want to have a family that's based on more than just what we can do for each other." I studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulation and self-interest that had characterized our recent interactions. But what I saw was something I hadn't seen in years, genuine remorse and maybe the beginning of wisdom. "That would be a good start," I said. "But it would have to be different this time. It would have to be real." "I know. And I know it won't happen overnight. I know I have a lot to prove." As Glenn prepared to leave that evening, he turned back one more time. "Dad, I know you don't owe me anything, and I'm not asking for money. But would you be willing to have dinner with me sometime, just to talk?" I looked at this man who'd been my whole world for so many years, who'd broken my heart, and then, maybe, just maybe, started to put it back together. "I'd like that, Glenn. But let's start small. How about coffee next week?" For the first time in months, my son smiled. Not the confident, professional smile he'd perfected for his career, but the genuine, slightly uncertain smile of the boy who used to help me fix cars in the garage and ask endless questions about how everything worked. I'd like that too. After he left, I sat in my living room as darkness fell outside, feeling something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, but something close to it. Hope, maybe. The possibility that the son I'd raised was still there underneath all the ambition and pretense. But I also knew that this was just the beginning. Real change takes time, and trust, once broken, isn't easily repaired. Glenn would have to prove his words with actions consistently over months and years. For now, though, it was enough that he was willing to try. And for the first time in a very long time, so was I. 6 months later, I was working in my garden on a warm May morning when I heard a car door close in my driveway. I looked up from the tomato seedlings I was transplanting to see Glenn walking toward me, but something was different about his approach. He wasn't rushing, wasn't carrying the weight of desperation or crisis that had characterized his visits over the past year. He looked peaceful. "Morning, Dad. Mind if I join you?" I gestured to the patch of soil I'd prepared for peppers. "Grab those gloves from the shed. These seedlings won't plant themselves." We worked in comfortable silence for a while, something that would have been impossible 6 months ago. The quiet between us used to be filled with tension, with unspoken demands and disappointments. Now it felt like the companionable silence Margaret and I used to share when we worked together on household projects. "I got a job," Glenn said eventually, carefully placing a pepper plant in the hole I'd dug. "Where?" "Community General Hospital. It's not prestigious, and the pay isn't what I thought I'd be making at this point in my career. But it's honest work, helping people who really need medical care." I nodded, covering the plant's roots with soil. "That sounds like good work." "It is. Most of our patients are uninsured or underinsured. People who work construction jobs, or in restaurants or cleaning offices, people like the families I grew up around before I decided I was too good for that world." There was no bitterness in his voice, just recognition. Over the past 6 months, through our weekly coffee meetings and occasional dinners, I'd watched Glenn slowly shed the artificial persona he'd constructed and rediscover the values Margaret and I had tried to instill in him as a child. "How are you adjusting to living on a smaller income?" Glenn smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Better than I expected. I'm renting a small apartment near the hospital. Nothing fancy, but it's mine and I can afford it on my own. After living with Amelia's parents for 3 months, having my own space feels like luxury." He paused, brushing dirt from his hands. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said about love being a verb, about relationships being built on respect instead of what people can provide. I think I understand now why my marriage failed." "Oh?" "Amelia and I never actually knew each other. We knew each other's ambitions, each other's plans, each other's potential earning capacity, but we didn't know each other's values or fears or what made us happy beyond material success." I stood up, stretching my back and surveying our morning's work. 2 neat rows of vegetables planted with care and attention, ready to grow slowly and naturally into something nourishing. It seemed like an appropriate metaphor. That's a hard lesson to learn at 35. It is. But I'm grateful I learned it now instead of wasting another decade living someone else's idea of success. Glenn had been coming by every Saturday morning for the past 3 months, not asking for anything, just spending time. Sometimes we worked in the garden, sometimes we fixed things around the house, sometimes we just sat on the porch and talked about everything and nothing. He was learning slowly how to be a son again, instead of a supplicant. "There's something else," he said as we gathered up our tools. "I've been seeing someone." I raised an eyebrow. "Anyone I might approve of?" "Her name is Linda. She's a nurse at the hospital. She's different from Amelia. She drives a 10-year-old Honda that she bought used and takes care of herself. She lives in a small apartment and cooks dinner instead of ordering takeout. She's never asked me what kind of car I drive or how much money I make. She sounds sensible. She is. And she's kind. Really kind, not performing kindness to get something in return. When I told her about what happened with you, about how I'd treated you, she was shocked. She said anyone who would exclude their father from a celebration they'd helped make possible wasn't someone she wanted to know. I looked at Glenn with new interest. And yet she's still seeing you. I told her I was working to become a better man. She said she'd give me a chance to prove it, but that actions would matter more than words. I like her already. We were walking back to the house when Glenn stopped suddenly. Dad, there's something I need to give you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. This is for you. I opened it to find a check for $5,000. Glenn, what is this for? It's a start. It's not nearly enough to repay what you spent on my education or what you lost when the clinic failed, but it's what I can afford right now. I want to pay you back, all of it, eventually. I looked at the check, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Pride that Glenn had managed to save this much on his hospital salary. Sadness that he felt he needed to repay gifts that had been given out of love. And something else. Respect for the man he was becoming. I appreciate this, Glenn, but you don't owe me money. What you owed me was respect and recognition, and you've been giving me that. Take it anyway. Not because I owe it to you, but because I want to give it to you, because I want to be someone who contributes to your life instead of just taking from it. I folded the check and put it in my shirt pocket. Thank you. I'll put it in Margaret's memorial fund at the church. That's perfect. As we reached the house, Glenn hesitated before getting back in his car. Dad, Linda wants to meet you. Would you be interested in having dinner with both of us sometime? I'd like that very much. Good. How about next Sunday? Nothing fancy, just dinner here if that's okay with you. Linda offered to cook. A nurse who cooks. I definitely like her. Glenn laughed, and for a moment I saw the boy he used to be before ambition and insecurity had twisted him into someone I barely recognized. There's one more thing, he said. Linda and I were talking about what we want our future to look like, and she asked if you'd be part of it. Not in the background, not as an obligation, but as family. As someone we want to share good news with, someone we want to spend holidays with, someone whose opinion matters to us. I felt my throat tighten with emotion I hadn't expected. And what did you tell her? I told her that I hoped you'd be willing to give me that chance, but that I'd understand if you needed more time to trust me again. I looked at my son, this man who'd hurt me deeply and was now working to heal that hurt, and I felt something I'd thought was lost forever. Not the desperate love of a parent who enables bad behavior, but the proud love of a father who sees his child choosing to become a better person. I think I'd like to be part of your future, Glenn. But I want to be clear about something. What's that? I'm not the same father I was before. I won't make my life smaller to accommodate your comfort. I won't apologize for who I am or where I come from, and I won't enable behavior I don't respect, no matter how much I love you. Glenn nodded, seriously. I wouldn't want you to. The father I need now is the one who was strong enough to walk away when I wasn't treating you right. The one who taught me that love has to be earned through actions, not just assumed because of blood. As he drove away that morning, I went back into the house and made myself a fresh cup of coffee. I pulled out the check Glenn had given me and looked at it again. It wasn't the amount that mattered, it was what it represented. A son who was learning to give instead of just take, to contribute instead of just consume. I walked to my desk and found a piece of Margaret's stationery, the cream-colored paper she'd used for thank you notes and condolences. I wrote a brief note to the church secretary explaining that I wanted to add $5,000 to Margaret's memorial fund, money given to me by our son in honor of the values she'd taught him. That afternoon, I called Linda at the hospital and introduced myself. Her voice was warm and genuine, and when I told her I was looking forward to meeting her, I could hear the smile in her response. Glenn talks about you all the time, she said. He's so proud of the relationship you two are rebuilding. He says you taught him what real strength looks like. He's learning. We both are. I hope you don't mind me saying this, but what you did, walking away when he wasn't treating you right, that took incredible courage. A lot of parents would have just accepted whatever treatment they got because they were afraid of losing their children completely. I almost did lose him completely. But I learned something important. You can't have a real relationship with someone who doesn't respect you, and you can't teach respect by accepting disrespect. That evening, I sat on my porch as the sun set, thinking about the strange journey that had brought Glenn and me to this place. The pain of his rejection had been real and deep, but it had also been necessary. It had forced both of us to examine what we really wanted from our relationship and what we were willing to give to get it. Phone rang as I was preparing for bed. Glenn's name appeared on the caller ID, and for just a moment I felt an echo of the old anxiety. What did he want now? But when I answered, his voice carried none of the tension or desperation I'd grown accustomed to. "Dad, I just wanted to say thank you. For today, for the past few months, for being patient with me while I figured things out." "You don't need to thank me for that, Glenn." "Yes, I do. I put you through hell and you still gave me a chance to make it right. Not everyone would have done that." "Well, not everyone gets to have a son who's willing to do the hard work of becoming a better man." After we hung up, I prepared for bed with a sense of contentment I hadn't felt in years, not because my life had suddenly become perfect, but because it had become honest. The relationships in my life now were built on mutual respect and genuine caring, not on obligation or need. As I turned off the lights, I thought about Margaret and how proud she would be of the man Glenn was becoming. Not the successful doctor she'd dreamed of, but something better. A good man who understood that character mattered more than status, that relationships were more valuable than achievements, and that love was indeed a verb that required action to have meaning. For the first time in years, I fell asleep without any regrets about the choices I'd made. I'd learned to put myself first when necessary, to demand respect instead of accepting scraps, and to understand that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is refuse to enable their child's worst impulses. Glenn was building a new life on a foundation of humility and genuine connection. I was enjoying a retirement based on my own terms and values, and together, we were learning that the best relationships are the ones where both people choose to be there, not because they have to, but because they want to. It had taken loss and pain and some very hard lessons to get here, but we'd arrived at something real and sustainable, something worth building on, something worth keeping.